I think we're actually going to start a minute early. We have, although I do see people walking up the steps, we don't want to rush anybody, but we'd like to start on time. And thank you all so much for being here. That's mainly what I want to say is it's wonderful after a 3-year hiatus to have such a good crowd to see all these extraordinary authors that we have got here with us. I'm going to hand it over now to Mindy Todd, who is going to interview and introduce our authors for tonight, Greer Hendricks and Scott Turow, both of whom I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So Mindy is our representative from WCAI, our Cape and Islands NPR station, host and producer and host of The Point, her show, and she is here representing WCAI as well as helping us, who's one of our lead sponsors and to whom we are eternally grateful. So here, Mindy.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin. Thank you. And Greer Hendricks, #1 New York Times bestselling co-author of The Wife Between Us, An Anonymous Girl, You Are Not Alone, and The Golden Couple. Welcome, Greer. Good to see you.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yeah,
it's on.
Yeah, you're on.
Thank you.
Scott Turow, author of 12 best-selling works of fiction, including Presumed Innocent, The Last Trial. In September, his newest novel will come out, Suspect. Is that right?
Correct.
Got it, okay. So before your fabulous careers as writers, Greer, you were at Simon & Schuster as an editor. And so did you just kind of go, hey, I could do this? I mean, where did that change come that you decided that you were going to write books? And we should mention you write with Sarah Pekkanen. It's the two of you together.
Yes. So, I mean, probably like many writers, I always wanted to be a writer. Ever since I was a little girl, you know, I was writing short stories and poems. But I tucked that dream aside and I worked in magazines. I got my master's in journalism at Columbia, and then I went on to be a book editor. So I was comfortable in the book sphere, but I just wasn't comfortable making that leap to being a writer. And so, you know, over the years, I, would kind of get up and try to write, but I didn't really pursue it. I got very, very close to my co-author, Sarah Pekkanen. We worked together on 7 books together, and 20 years into my tenure at Simon & Schuster, I just said, I have to give this a shot. I'm not a risk taker by nature at all. But my husband, who years ago I had taken out my 401k and given it to him to start his business, and he said, it's your turn now. So I quit, and I wasn't telling a lot of people that I wanted to write because it's a really scary thing to admit, and what if you can't do it? But I confessed the secret to just a couple of people, and one was my co-author, Sarah, who I had gotten really close to. We had a number of uncanny similarities. We were the exact same age. We had studied psychology and journalism. We're both terrible cooks. And I confessed this to her, and this is the short version, she said, why don't we write a book together? And at first I thought, gosh, I should try to do this by myself. That seems like the kind of grown-up way or the right way to do it. And then I realized that's crazy. I've written a couple of articles. I mean, I'd edited hundreds of books, but I didn't know how to write a book, and I thought this will be a master class in learning how to write.
Yeah. And high-powered attorney. I mean, you U.S. Attorney's Office. You were a prosecutor, a defense attorney as well, right? So,
right.
So, when did you decide, like, hey, maybe I ought to try writing a little bit about what I know here?
Well, first I have to sort of in the trial lawyer's fashion give rebuttal to Greer because I have to acknowledge that I'm sure many novelists and other writers are very disappointed by your success because it's common for writers, I think, to get great feedback from their editors, but there's also a little soundtrack playing in the background with the equivalent of which is, those who can do and those who can't edit. So to be able to both, talk the talk and walk the walk is a terrific achievement, and
Thank you.
I salute you for that.
Thank you.
My story is often misunderstood. My dream from the time I was a kid following kind of in my mom's footsteps, was that I told everybody who would listen that I wanted to be a novelist. And I went to Amherst College here in Massachusetts, and then I was a writing fellow at Stanford for a number of years. Somehow in the course of those 5 years at Stanford, I was teaching for the last 3 of them, and that taught me in a moment of great honesty with myself that I didn't want to be an academic. It's a terrific career with all kinds of pluses, but it wasn't for me. And instead, what shocked me was that, many of my college roommates had gone off to law school. But what was instructive was how many friends I was making in the Bay Area who, those who were not writers were lawyers. And my dad, I always like to say, was a prophet in his own time, and that he was a doctor who hated lawyers long before it was common for doctors to do that. But so I didn't know many lawyers. I didn't know what they did. And when I began to find out what it was, I was thought, gosh, this is really interesting. And so I turned down a really good academic job and decided to go to law school. But I vowed to myself at least that I was not going to stop writing. And just by enormous fortuity, it was hard to explain to my then literary agent that I was sort of going to go to law school because it sounded like I was giving up. And so I got in the middle of this letter to her to tell her I was, making this U-turn in my life, and I started pitching out an idea in the middle of a letter that, I haven't been able to find a book about being a law student, and I wasn't really proposing to write it because I didn't think of myself as a nonfiction writer. But she didn't notice that and presented the letter to an editor, and I ended up with a contract to write that book. But I had taken my own measure well, and I really was interested in law, and so I ended up trying to live the life I said I would, which was both practicing law and writing.
Yeah, and I know something that maybe you don't know about 1L, the book you're talking about, your first year in law school. My sister-in-law right there, she has a friend who's an attorney who went to the University of Michigan. Now, she graduated back in 1988. It was not required by the university, but required by those incoming freshmen to read your book. Yeah.
Yeah, I and my publishers have been lucky that way. I mean, it's 42 or 43 years later, and 45 actually, as I think about it, and 1L still in print.
Still in print, yeah. So I'm wondering how the process Greer works for you and Sarah, because you mentioned you thought maybe I should do this myself, but and because you're different. I mean, you bring different things to the table, right? Mm-hmm. Sarah likes it messy, right?
You've done your research. You've done your research.
And you like it organized. And so how does that work? You guys meet in a hotel and you just work through things, right?
No. No. So Sarah lives outside of DC and I live in Manhattan. So when we had this brilliant idea to write together, the first thing we did was pull our favorite books off of our bookshelves. And unsurprisingly, there was a lot of overlap. So at the time, it was, there was Gone Girl, Girl on a Train, Jean Hanna Corliss, You Should Have Known. We had Before I Go to Sleep. So we knew we wanted to write something psychological in nature with a strong female protagonist, but we didn't really know what or how. We did have our first meeting was this top secret meeting in a hotel room in New York, and we sat side by side, and we wrote 15 pages, literally, in this flurry of it was this honeymoon euphoria, and we thought these pages were so great, and we sent them off to our agent. We were like, look, we've got this great idea, and here we're off and running, and she was like, let me tell you, dolls, like, go back to the drawing board. Like, she was very, like, agenty, you know? And so we went back and did, you know, a lot of revising. But the question, after the hotel stint was, how are we going to do this? Obviously, Sarah was not going to come to New York, you know, every day to write. So my daughter, who was then 13, was like, hey, Mom, there's this newfangled technology called Google Docs and Google Hangouts. And so Sarah and I, every morning at 9 o'clock, we would go on these walk and talks, and we would talk endlessly, what if, would plot out the scene that we were working on, and then we would go to our desks and work on Google Docs and Google Hangouts. So we would each take turns sort of manning the computer, one person talking, the other one typing, going in. It was almost like this weird twin language, but we had talked so much about the scene that it just sort of would come out in a very, very fluid way. And then we go in mornings and nights separately and edit and revise. We do go to hotels, or we did pre-COVID, kind of every other month, and bring the person whose city was being visited would bring these giant Post-its and snacks. And I just would like to say, like, I always brought, like, the really good Post-its, the ones that really stuck on the walls, and, like, really good snacks. And she'd come in with, like, these little, you know, flimsy things, but, you know, she's not here to defend herself, so. But we would go, you know, line the walls with our ideas. And she likes the messy. It's like Carrie Mathison in Homeland, and she'd be pinning them all over, and I'd be, like, going around straightening them up after them. I'm like, I can't concentrate like this. Like, her computer screen is just like, you know, it's a jigsaw puzzle of, you know, images, and I was like, I could never concentrate that way. Somehow it seems to work.
Yeah. You have a great quote, Scott. You say, a novelist is a great gig. You get to go upstairs and play with your imaginary friends. Talk about your process. Do you write every day? What is your process?
Well, first, I'm just in amazement with what you're describing, although I'm looking, you know, my pal Ridley Pearson is out there, and he's done this with our mutual friend Dave Barry. But I find it, I regard, for me, the writing process is incredibly intimate. And you know, they're my imaginary friends. I don't want anybody else playing with them. You know, what happens if they don't like me anymore? And so
it's definitely not for everyone.
I just think it's amazing, and I know people do it and do it well, but it's so foreign to my experience, especially when I'm in the stage that I am now, which is starting to think about another book, and most of the work that I'm doing is entirely inside my head, and not even, I couldn't even say most of it out loud because I wouldn't get to the end of a sentence because I haven't figured out how the end of the sentence, you know, figuratively speaking, works. But you know what, I'll be in this cogitative state for several months, and I am writing things down along the way, but not much. Sometimes just one-word notes, because I know what I want to come back to. And then when it's coherent in my own head, even though it doesn't mean I know the ending, then I'll start a first draft. But it'll take many months of just kind of pure randomness before I get going. And you know, just looking at Ridley and thinking about the way he does stuff, you know, all writers end up in the same place, but how they get there is so amazingly different. It's just, you know, it's wonderful to listen to.
I'm wondering about, you know, the courtroom. The courtroom can be quite a dramatic place, right? And especially in your books, right? So how much of what you're writing has been inspired by your actual court cases, actual experiences in the courtroom, or other attorneys or judges? How much of that is based on reality, and how much of it is completely from your imagination?
Well, first of all, your point is well taken. the courtroom is an inherently dramatic place because people show up there because they want something to change. You know, often it's the prosecutor who wants the defendant to be imprisoned. Even as a civil case, though, you know, people think they're owed something or they don't owe anybody anything. So you walk through the door knowing that things are going to be different. But it didn't really dawn on me how dramatic the courtroom was until I was sitting there as an observer. And the case on trial was what would be passed off as a very minor offense. It was selling food stamps. And, you know, so somebody would buy the food stamps and be able to, they'd pay less than face value and be able to buy food in those amounts. But somehow the way this scheme operated, I looked around the courtroom and people's jaws were hanging open. They were transfixed when the star witness was on the stand. And I suddenly said to myself, my long quest for, you know, a subject that I thought would be universal, that quest was over. This was it. Criminal law had always fascinated me before I started to go to law school. And then I saw, you know, this is what I should be writing about. I know this. I was a prosecutor by then, and I can bring to it the elements that, you know, beguile me. And that's really what has happened. And do I steal from my cases? You know, in candor, the Code of Professional Responsibility imposes limitations on how freely lawyers can steal their clients' lives. So, I've tried to be very careful over the years to make sure nobody complains about me having appropriated the details of their case. But, you know, it's still an inherently exciting milieu, and by itself, it's inspiring. And, you know, a couple of judges I've gotten even with, but, you know.
So there wasn't really an attorney who gave closing arguments and had a heart attack in real life. That didn't happen.
Not yet.
Not yet. So that question for both of you, when do you keep like meticulous notes, especially when you have recurring characters, right? And do your characters, I hear a lot of authors say this, you'll have a character who's got a minor role, but somehow they keep talking to you and they get this bigger role in your story than you ever intended. You're both nodding, so yes, it does happen. So what kinds of notes and how do you deal with those characters who just won't shut up?
Well, I mean, I think when Sarah and I are plotting our books, we view that, you know, let's say I'm starting in New York and I'm going to California. Like, we tend to know that we want to get to California. We just don't always know exactly how we're going to get to California. And I guess that's somewhat the same with our authors. Like, I mean, with our characters. Ooh, that was some sort of Freudian slip there. But we will have a character, and you know, they just might turn out to be a lot more interesting. Like in The Golden Couple, the book that we that just published in March, there was a sales clerk, Polly, and we just needed, you know, kind of, she was just going to be this little, you know, sales clerk, not have a big role. But Polly became so interesting. She became a whole, you know, kind of almost like a suspect in our story about what was her role in the book, because she was just so quirky. And same with, there was another character, Natalie, who was an ex-girlfriend of the husband, and we felt Natalie we just fell in love with her, and we wanted to just write more Natalie, so she became a bigger part as well.
How about for you, Scott?
I think every novelist will, I'm looking at our mutual friend Jean Corlitt's back there, and I think every novelist has the same experience, which is that, you know, there's almost always a character who runs away with the book and who just forces her or himself into a larger role, starts talking to you and won't shut up. And that's great. It's great. because you think you know where you're going, and then you find out you didn't know in the first place. And, when I feel my writing is going well, I will just hear the characters speaking to each other. And of course I go back and reshape and cross things out, but in that trance state, it's just really kind of happening in the theater of my mind.
Do you want to say something? Go ahead.
Well, I just was thinking, this is sort of tangential, but I was thinking about characters, and the way that I come up with a lot of characters' names is I look at my bookshelves, and often then they're names of authors. And so there was a character in The Wife Between Us, and we named her Maureen, and Maureen was a friend of mine and also an author. And Maureen was going to be a real ally to our main character in the book. And then Maureen suddenly became quite a different character. She became really pretty creepy and evil. Well, the real Maureen, when my book came out, said, "I'd like to host a book party for you. I can't wait to read your book." And I said, "Maureen, I've just got to tell you, this character was named after you, but she was really good to begin with, and then she changed." And luckily, Maureen is an author and understood how this stuff happens.
How about revisiting minor characters in your stories, especially when you've got some of the same characters that recur in books? Do you say, maybe I'll bring this character back and give him or her a bigger role? Do you ever?
I mean, that's basically my whole body of work. I mean, Sandy Stern was Rusty Savich's defense lawyer in Presumed Innocent, and I thought he was so engaging that he then became the protagonist of my second novel. And people, I love the way the characters move from the background to the foreground, and people who are less significant in the flow of a story, all of a sudden, 2 books on, take it over. And, and that's the book that'll come out in September. Sandy Stern, and who I went back to in my last novel, The Last Trial, had a very eccentric granddaughter who was working as a paralegal in the law firm. And I became fascinated with her, and I said, okay, Pinky's going to get her own book, and she has. So.
Since you mentioned Sandy, somebody asked us earlier when we had Louise Penny here talking about Inspector Gamache is getting a little bit older, and what's going to happen. Sandy is 80-something right now, and he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Yeah. But then magically there was this drug that helps him. So what is Sandy's future? Do you know?
If you read, Suspect or Suspect, as I sometimes pronounce it to myself, you will find out what's up with. You'll find out what's up with Sandy.
We have to wait until September for that, though.
But he's not dead yet. I'll just say.
So both of you have had your books made into either TV shows or films, and I'm wondering how you feel about that, because sometimes it can be bittersweet, right? I mean, it's not going to be the book. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, was it a good experience for you, or?
Well, mine have only been optioned; they haven't been made yet. Okay. So far the experience has been exciting. I mean, Sarah and I, for The Wife Between Us, it was optioned on a partial manuscript when it was sold to our publisher. And it was just exciting to get to talk to all of the Hollywood executives who actually had a lot of really interesting thoughts about how we should finish the book. And then we did finish the book, and our film agent was having a really hard time finding someone to write the screenplay. And so we were on tour for our book, and we got a call saying that this fabulous woman, Holly Berria, wanted to meet Sarah and I in New York City. And we had been on tour, and when you're on tour, you bring a carry-on, that's it, because you can't have your bag lost. And we were in LaGuardia Airport fishing out, is this too wrinkled? Is this too stained? We're meeting with the head of Amblin, and we show up, and we talk to her, and she is nice as can be. And she says, so I invited you here because I'm wondering if you guys would want to try to take a shot at writing the screenplay. And so one of the things I don't know if I've made really clear, but Sarah's very instinctive and intuitive, and I'm much more cautious. So like Sarah's like ready to say, yes, yes, yes. And I'm like, well, we'd like to think about that. And so we did, we thought about it, and we said yes. And she said, well, you're gonna have to pitch it to us. You know, we're not just gonna give you the job. So at Google, being our best friend, we're Google, how to pitch a screenplay. And so we did, we pitched it, and we got the job, and we wrote the screenplay, and they were like, it's great, it's great, it's great. And then they came back to us and they said, so you need to rewrite it entirely from this, perspective. Anyway, it's still, it keeps being, optioned, but nothing's happened. So I can't speak to the experience, but Scott can.
But Scott, yes, you can speak from experience.
I did a panel once with Ed Doctorow while he was alive, and he says the best thing that can happen to the novelist is that they pay you for your work and they don't make the movie. and I think that's exactly wrong. The best thing that can happen is they pay you for your work and they make a really good movie out of it. And that is almost always a boost to a novelist's career. I've had generally really great experiences in Hollywood, but having a book optioned or even sold does not mean that the film is going to get made. My buddy Richard North Patterson likes to say that film deals are like sperm, many are called, but few are chosen. And I've learned over time to be, sanguine about it. You just have to let that process play out. I've always kept Hollywood at arm's length in terms of I would never agree to write a screenplay from one of my own novels because I would feel that I was being asked to perform surgery on myself. I have done some screenwriting, and I regard it as a true art, but I write the book, they make the movie, and I like the separation, so.
What about, how has COVID impacted your writing? I've talked to some authors who were like, man, I whipped that book out so fast. Normally it would take me, X amount of time, or others who just had a more difficult time. What has life been like for you writing in COVID, Greer?
Well, first of all, our third book came out. So Sarah's very superstitious, and she hates the number 3. And the book came out on 3/3 in 2020. So we were on tour for that book, and we had obviously canceled our tour halfway through, and my family and I came here because we have a home here, and this was a great place to be during COVID. Sarah and I immediately started working on the book that became The Golden Couple, but we had to mix up our process a bit because it used to be, I'd be home alone. Well, my dogs were a little noisy, but it was just me and the dogs. She was home alone. All of a sudden, I have my husband who likes to, go and make smoothies and blast the blender, and my kids who are, they were on Zoom school, and her kids and her son's like, Mom, what's for lunch? That really breaks the creative process. So we still did a lot of our walk and talks, but we did a lot more individual writing. And the book actually did come out. The third book was a nightmare from start to finish. It was really hard. The fourth book just it just came out effortlessly. But what did happen, this is a big reveal here, is that it made us we both did more individual writing, and now, even though we both have another book under contract, we both are writing individual books. So I'm listening to everything you're saying as kind of an observer. So COVID really did shake things up a bit.
So you're writing one by yourself, or you've already written it?
You're in the process.
You're in the process. Oh, exciting.
Yeah.
All right, how about for you, Scott? How did COVID impact you?
Well, I had a high school journalism teacher who said that, a journalist can write anywhere. And so, and always tried to incorporate that. Much of Presumed Innocent was written on the morning commuter train. And I write on trains and planes and occasionally in hotel rooms. But, I've always had an office at home. That's always been where I write. If somebody comes into my space and starts talking to me, that is the more difficult. And certainly Adrian was home more during COVID. And the one thing I'm just sort of sitting here thinking about is, did I write faster during COVID? And I certainly did. I've attributed the fact that I, gave up the practice of law in August of 2020 to explain the speed with which I wrote Suspect compared to the books that have gone before. But now I'm wondering if maybe it was COVID and this is, it's going to be harder to keep up that pace.
Yeah. Somebody said a good writer is a good listener, and I'm wondering, when you're looking for ideas, are you like listening to people's conversations and making mental notes? And when you're doing like either character development or plot themes, and how much do how do you, are you going to forget? I would have to write it down right now because by the time I get home, I'd be like, wait, what was it I wanted to make note of? I mean, so, do you listen and say, that's an interesting person I'm listening to. Maybe I can incorporate it in my new character.
Yeah, I mean, of course, yes. There's, someone will say something, you'll think it was either so interesting or so absurd or so just that it would fit with a character that you're working on. And some things really stay with you, but a lot of times if you don't write it down, you think you're going to remember. You always think you're going to remember. I mean, I don't. I wake up often in the middle of the night, and I know I'm not supposed to have my phone by my bed, but I pull out my phone and I email myself. My handwriting is so bad that in the middle of the night, if I would try to write it down, I would never be able to read. So that's a lot of times, or when I'm running, I'll get ideas as well, and I'm like, we'll stop and write them down. But yeah, you have to be a good listener, a good observer, for sure.
You too, Scott?
I had a line that I haven't written down yet, but I will, that, in many ways, people are defined by the details that they think are important. And when I'm in this gestational mood, the details that I think are important, that are striking, that I want to put in the book I'm working on are, they would strike somebody as irrational. You're in conversation with somebody and some guy walks by and he's got a very odd nose. And I start thinking about, well, what happens if the character's in a bar with a guy who's got a nose like this? So it's not purloined from life per se. It's not the very smart thing that the person I'm talking to is saying, but the nose on the guy who just happens to amble by.
So any of us could end up in your books, see? Yeah, right? How about questions from the audience? Anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Yeah, back there, if you can speak up too.
Yeah, sure. My question is, since writing is kind of an artistic, personal style, when you're co-authoring a book, how do you write it so that it melds together and doesn't look like two people wrote the story?
Yeah, the question is, when you're writing a book with somebody else, how do you meld it together so it doesn't seem like it's written by two people? Yeah.
That's a great question, and a lot of co-authors will either alternate. There'll be two characters in the book, and they'll alternate chapters. In our first few books, when people didn't know how we wrote, people would always be like, "Were you Nellie? Were you Vanessa? Were you this?" Or they'll alternate chapters. I think because Sarah and I talk so much before we start writing that it could be months, and then before we write each scene, we have really figured out who the characters are, and I mean, maybe our writing style is not so oddly unique that it's just the voice. It's the voice of the character that we hear. We had this one character in our second book, Dr. Shields, and Sarah really heard her voice a lot more clearly before I did. Like, she just kind of instinctively knew it, and it was actually harder for me to get that voice down. It took more time, so that one was a little bit trickier, but on the whole, we seem to get it.
So Greer, do you have sometimes where somebody will say, hey, who came up with this idea? And you both go, I don't know, was it you? Was it me?
Yeah, we have a lot of that. There's definitely some specific ideas that for sure we can identify who, but a lot of times there'll be a line and she'll be like, you wrote that line. I'm like, no, you wrote that line. So, yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, way back here.
You've both spoken about early on contact or interacting with an agent, and I'm wondering how that comes along when you're early on in your careers.
Did you catch the question? Was it
Yeah,
about
the question was basically, how did we get an agent?
Yeah.
agent?
How did we
How
get
you got
an
your
agent?
agents?
Right.
Yeah.
Which is frankly the single most asked question in an author's life. I really liked your book and I thought it was wonderful, but how did you get your agent? And it's, in my case, it was completely happenstance. Because I was in the writing program at Stanford, where there have been many wonderful writers to emerge, that was of interest and to agents. But the first agent I got, there was a agent named Lynn Nesbitt, very famous, powerful agent. And I had written a group of stories in my last year at Amherst College and sent it off to an editor who asked to see him, and I never heard from this guy again. And I'm reading Time Magazine and Lynn Nesbitt, powerful agent, and I wrote her this, mendicant letter just begging for her help. And to my shock, the phone rang one day in California, and she says, I'm going to get your manuscript back for you. And she said, I can't represent you, but I have a younger colleague who would probably be great. And then the younger colleague was not great for me, but a couple years later, with one of my colleagues at Stanford, we agreed to an agent swap. Because he wasn't getting along with his agent, I wasn't getting along with this agent, and we had this agent swap. And then the agent I have now, Gail Hockman, was actually the editorial assistant on 1L, and then she went out on her own and became an agent, and I thought she was just one of the niftiest people I'd ever met, and was smart enough to ask her eventually to represent me.
What about you, Greer?
My situation was is definitely unique because I had been an editor for 20 years. I knew so many agents in the business. It actually would have been challenging for me to almost try to decide who I wanted, if my material was good enough. So I just joined forces with Sarah's agent. She had already had an agent, and that agent represented us. We have since switched, but it wasn't the rigorous process that most first authors have to go through. My advice to anyone out here who is looking to find an agent is look at books that seem similar to the one that you're working on. And look in the back. Most authors, if they like their agent, acknowledge them and reach out to that agent, and then say I'm reaching out to you because XYZ, my book is like so and so's book, and that's at least a good way to start. It makes you look like you've done your homework. So that's what I always advise people.
And the agent will like it because at least you've noticed him or her, and have some idea what they do for a living.
Yeah. Other question? Yes, right here.
So Scott, I read 1L 40 years ago and went to law school anyway, so I appreciate that. I'm just curious why you continued to practice even after you became a successful novelist.
Why you quit your practice? And you were doing both for a while there.
I did both for more than 30 years. Why did I do it? When I sold Presumed Innocent to Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, Raj Strauss, there were two Roger Strausses, the father and the son, and Raj, the younger, flew out to Chicago to take me to lunch. And he drove me back to the Sears Tower, and he was before I got out of the car, he said, please don't quit practicing for a year. He said, give it a year. I said, because I know so many people who are sort of wowed by their own success that they turn their life upside down and then they can't remember how they got to the point where they were able to write. And my attitude always was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I went to law school because I was fascinated with the law. I certainly practiced a lot less as the years went on. I became part-time. I had the great liberty at, the former Sonnenschein firm of being able to just pick my cases, most of them pro bono, and I was in the very enviable position of not having to make a living practicing law. So it was easy for me to continue. But I loved it, I loved it. I still have this one pro bono matter I work on. And one of the things is, I know people generally don't cotton to lawyers, but I really think I've met more great people of, immense capacity, not just intellectual, but spiritual and moral, practicing law than I would have in any other calling. And that's part of what kept me in it.
Over here, yep.
I have a question for Greer. As a former editor, do you find that still helps you with your writing process before you even talk to Sarah, or do you feel that sometimes pulls you back because you're editing yourself before it even gets to Sarah, your Google Doc, or your own editor?
Yeah,
So the
that's a great question.
So the question is, does she find that her experience as an editor, you're editing yourself, does it hold you back or help you?
That is a great question. I feel like this is now group therapy here. So I think it was a blessing and a curse. And where it really helped, I felt like, was understanding the marketing, the positioning of the book, the questions to ask my editor. I could bring an editorial hat to the table I loved my editor, and she was so smart and great. So it felt very collaborative. I probably do second guess myself maybe more, but I don't know. Writers second guess themselves, all the time. So I'm actually not really sure, because I can only view it sort of from my, from my own experience. A lot of people ask if I did more of the editing and Sarah did more of the writing, and that was not the case. She went in and edited me just as much as I edited her. But I'm gonna think more about that.
One more question? Over here, go ahead.
I wasn't going to say anything, but just because of what you just said, Scott, about the integrity of attorneys, I'm reminded of something you said back in the 1980s about when you were asked why you thought the legal thriller had kind of exploded and why people were suddenly so fascinated by this world. And you said something about how attorneys were the ones facing moral quandaries. And that made a huge impact on me, and I'm sure on a lot of other people. And I just think it's interesting how 50 years later, that essentially said commercial safety.
Yeah, the speaker is, as I said, our mutual friend Gene Korlitz, who's gone from having been the editorial assistant to my editor, Jonathan Galassi, when I wrote Presumed Innocent, to being a best-selling novelist in her own right. What I was referring to was that I thought increasingly in the United States, beginning in the 1980s, institutions that had previously decided questions of value, like local communities or churches, no longer had universal adherence, and sort of the church at which everybody was forced to worship was the law. And so the law began deciding questions, some of which still bedevil us, like abortion, but deep moral questions, surrogate motherhood, all kinds of issues. Should gay people be allowed to marry? It's hard not to be interested in the law when you begin to realize that a lot of the questions that are being wrestled with all the way across the country are ultimately going to be decided in courtrooms.
Greer Hendricks, Scott Turow, thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Our time just flew by. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you, Mindy.
Thank you. Thank you.
And okay, you guys are going to sign books, so we're going to let you go right down the center before everybody rushes out so that you can get your book signed at the table.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Great questions.